Okay, so today we'll be just starting with Angular forms. What exactly do we mean by form?
Ma'am, to submit the data or to get information from the user.
To submit the data or get information from the user. So to submit some data or to get the information from the user. Okay, fine. So what does a form consist of? A form consists of set of elements. That is like maybe the elements are just like your box, radio button, and these things. So now now we will see that how this particular forms Angular forms will help us to design our application. So what exactly are forms? Are nothing but they are the integral essential building blocks of your application. So these particular forms, generally when you try to develop your application where you need to have an interaction with the user, you may be using some forms. It may be like a login form or a forgot form or a registration or a checkout or a contact form, a form for adding a form for registration. So like this, you may be designing your application with various forms. Okay, so now this forms allow us to gather the information as what you just said. Now it will allow us to gather some information and data from the user. So one is you will enter the data and you will submit the data. That is one part of the usage of form. Or you will try to retrieve some information into the form which will help us to give some information. Then it will mainly, the main intention of using the form is to interact with the users. And for this particular form, to have a look and feel of this particular form, you will be either using frameworks like Bootstrap, or you will be using a material design. So for this will help us to beautify your forms. Okay, so now where exactly the forms, when you are using it, how exactly you can try to retrieve the information and how do you bind it? So what is that particular form supports? So when you just see that, it will help us to two-way by data binding. What is two-way data binding?
When data flows both sides.
Yeah, when the data is flowing from either component to template or template to component. Okay, so that is where exactly you can just use two-way data binding in the forms. The next part of it is change tracking. So what exactly change tracking is? Angular is having the facility where whenever a change is made in the form, it can try to track the change. So for example, now let us see that there you have given some fields as mandatory. So when you give a field as a mandatory and you are not entering some data into that, Angular can track that particular field should have some value. So the data in that particular field is mandatory. Or if you have given some, for example, you have a range valid control which will help you to identify the range within that value. So now you want to check it so that it will be able to change the tracking. So or if a button is enabled or disabled, if you have given a validations like minimum, it should have 10 characters, 8 characters, or it should have as uppercase, lowercase, it should have numbers, it should have special characters, something like that. If you have given such sort of validations, then Angular is having a facility which it can track it. Then error handling. So if any error occurs, then it can try to handle that particular error. And then finally, it will also support us for unit testing. That is a component based testing, which is a unit testing. So it will also support, the form also supports for unit testing. So what is unit testing in a form? For example, if I just want to test only the login form, so I'll be able to test only the login form. So if I want to test for the registration form, I can be able to test for the registration form. So like that unit testing, which I can just use it. So when we are talking about this particular forms, so what sorts of forms that Angular will support? Angular will support two types of forms. What are those two types of forms is one is static, that is we can call it as template driven forms, which we are using it as HTML. So what exactly is the static template driven forms here? So now when I tell static template driven, I'm telling you have HTML. So what exactly happens is the entire form is being controlled in the HTML file, that is in the component.html file. The entire thing has been, you are creating the form, designing, and you're trying to control it, and you are doing the validations, and you are trying to use that particular one. Totally the control is in the HTML file, that is component.html file. Since it is control is there in the template, we are calling it as template driven forms. So for example, if you want to have that particular form should be mandatory, then you can just use a validator which is there in HTML file, that is required. You can just write required. So where are you writing that required? Input type is equal to text, and then the name of the text, ID for that particular text, then on there only you can just write required. So what happens there? It is a template driven. So validation is being done from the template side only. So we call it as template driven. The next is a dynamic reactive forms. So what is this dynamic reactive forms? As the name indicates, it is a dynamic. It is, and the name of this forms is reactive forms, and this is component based class. So that is, this particular form is totally component based. That is nothing but the whatever you are trying to do with that particular form, you are trying to write within the class. So the entire logic behind that particular forms are being written in the class. So now you want that particular component to be mandatory. So where are you going to write? You are not going to write in the template. That is when you are creating the control. Input type is equal to text element. You are trying to write that part of it in the component class. So that is what we call it as component based forms, and these are called as reactive forms. So most of the and when you can use this particular forms is, one the advantage of reactive forms is the control, the entire control will be in the developer's hand. Why? Because he will be writing the entire how exactly the form should be controlled, what it is, that everything in the component class. So the control will be in the component class. That is where you are trying to use reactive forms. When you are trying to develop some complex applications, you can just go ahead and use reactive forms. So any clarification between these two, template and reactive?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Okay. Clear? Okay. So now we'll just see what exactly is template driven, and we'll just see some examples on template driven. So the template driven is very easy to use. Why? Because you are just writing it in the template, that is in HTML file. Simple and straightforward. It is very simple and straightforward. You want to create one text box, and with that particular text box, the value should be mandatory. It is very simple. So what you do, input type is equal to text, and then you will tell whatever the things, and then you will tell use required. So it's straightforward. Input type is equal to text. You are creating one text box, and then you are trying to give it as mandatory. You are writing it as required. So simple and straightforward. All validation form elements are defined in the template file itself. So now the validations are written within the template file itself, like required. You want that particular one should validate for email ID. So type is equal to email. You want that it should accept date, type is equal to date. Okay. So like this, you are going to do the validation, everything in the template file itself. So whenever you are using this template driven thing, different writing to define the template driven forms, what you need to do is you need to import forms module. So you need to import the forms module, and then you need to use this particular template driven forms. So the next part of it is dynamic, that is reactive forms. So these dynamic forms are called as reactive forms, they are also called as model driven forms. So you either can call it as reactive forms or model driven forms. Okay, frequently we only call it as reactive forms, or you can even call it as model-driven forms. Form elements have user interactions and validations are handled in the component class. So the entire form elements, user interaction, and as well as the validations, they are written in component class. And what is the main use of this reactive forms is you can control the data binding. So data binding can be controlled, and then you can write some custom regular expression patterns for error handling. So you can write your regular expressions whenever some error occurs, and then you need to import a reactive form module. You need to import it, and it is very flexible and allows the user for defining, developing complex applications and with complex requirements. And more of the logic of that particular element is written in component class, whereas only the designing part of it is being done in the HTML part of it. So whereas in a template driven, the design is in HTML, and even the basic validations are also in HTML itself. So hope that you understood what is the difference between the template driven and reactive forms.
Yes, ma'am, all clear.
Clear. Okay, which is better?
Reactive, of course.
Reactive, ma'am.
Reactive. Okay, so why is reactive better? Because it will help us to develop complex forms, multiple dynamic components, interactions, and you can write the validations by using the regular expressions based on your requirement. And the entire thing is being written in the component class, and the things you can generate during execution, that it is dynamic. And as per as your requirement, you can just define it. So the control will be in your hand. So that is the reason you will be able to use reactive forms. So that the reactive forms is better. Okay, so now before we start off reactive forms, we will see one small example on how exactly we can use template driven forms. So whenever you are using a template driven forms, what are the steps that you are supposed to do? First thing is you import, that is forms module, and add that in the imports. Then second thing is you create the form. Okay, after you create the form, you need to use ng model and ng forms. So whenever you're using this, you need to use your ng form and ng model. So now for every form field, so whatever the form field you are using, for example, you are using a text box, you're using a radio button, you are using a checkbox, you need to use ng model. And whenever you are using an ng model, so name attribute, for that it is a must that you need to add that name attribute for that particular element. And then once you finish that, you are supposed to use a form name as a template variable. So for the form, you need to give some name for the form. So that will be treated as a template variable. So that template variable will be started with hash. It will be prefixed with hash. Okay, so it will be prefixed with hash. So now these are the things which you need to remember when you are trying to create a template driven. So since you are using ng model, you need to import forms module. Second thing is you need to use ng form, and this particular ng form will help us to identify the template variable, and that should be prefixed with hash. ng model can be given to every field which is there in the form, and whenever you are using ng model, specify the name attribute for that particular element. Okay, so now we'll just one example.